Welcome to a new video from nzpocketguide.com. Today I'm going to draw in the 10 years experience living in New Zealand to give you my pros and cons of, well, living in New Zealand. Alright guys, so in this video I'm gonna draw from my experience living in New Zealand for 10 years, but also from my experience working and living overseas. Originally I was born in France and I worked and traveled in USA, in Canada and in Australia, and also visited quite a lot of countries in my life as well. So I'm going to use this experience to tell you what I think are the pros and cons in New Zealand. So to give you a little bit of feedback about who I am one of the writers behind NZPocketGuide.com. In fact, I started this business, so I'm going to also use a little bit of that business feedback that I'm going to have about life in New Zealand. This channel also is usually more of a travel channel. We're here to answer all your questions about traveling in New Zealand. So if you feel that I'm drawing a little bit too much onto the tourism and the experiences side of New Zealand, it's just because that's mainly why I'm living in New Zealand and also what I do with my entire life. So that's probably why this will transpire probably through this video. I also want to let you know that despite the fact that there is pros and cons on this list, and I'm going to finish with all the cons, that does not mean that I don't love New Zealand. I've been a resident in New Zealand for many years now and I love New Zealand. I've decided to live here. I chose New Zealand despite knowing all those pros and cons. So, take all the cons that I'm going to go over with a grain of salt. And finally, before we get started, we will put a timestamp right here. Here you go, if you want to jump straight away to the cons. If you already are convinced that you want to come to New Zealand and just want to know why you shouldn't, well, if you go to this time right now, you will be able to get all the cons straight away. With that in mind, let's get started with the pros. Alright, so I'm going to have some images on the side just because it's going to be more fun to have something else than just my face to look at. Alright, let's get started with the pros. The first biggest pros of living in New Zealand is the outdoors. New Zealand is a fantastic looking country. It is a super scenic country. It's a country where people come to shoot movie in that is that good looking. So the caliber of the outdoor scene in New Zealand is amazing. There is so much to visit, there is so much to explore that despite the fact that Laura is my partner, if you guys have never watched this channel, we have explored so much of New Zealand. We did something called New Zealand's Biggest Gap Year on this channel. You can watch us on video doing 365 activities all around New Zealand in only 365 days. And despite that, we don't feel that we have explored all of New Zealand just yet. Hell, where we're living right now, we haven't even done all the local walks either. So that's just to tell you that there is so much to explore in New Zealand. It's definitely worth taking the time to explore as much as you can. And if you're an outdoorsy person, New Zealand is going to be perfect for you. It's a paradise. Alright, my next pros are the people and community. People here are super friendly, super open-minded. It's fantastic to spend time with people here, and even it's super easy to meet people. Nowadays, despite the fact that we're in the era of social media and all that, it is not that easy to meet people. But that's a picture right here of me and a friend of mine called Simon that I met in Auckland. I was literally just going on my little business and working on my laptop in a cafe, and he's a local, he's a Kiwi, and he just came to see me and said, hey, you look like you're a foreigner, like, do you know anyone here? And, do you want to chat or something? Started introducing himself. And, since then we were friends, and, I started a business and he was starting a business as well. So we kind of we're supporting each other. And it's just, so rare to have stories like that nowadays. And I find that people here are so open-minded, so nice that it is definitely a pro on my list. Moving on, we have the healthcare system. So this is a picture of me when during New Zealand's Biggest Gap Year, there is a video of that. I broke my arm and so we had to go to the hospital. So yeah, the healthcare system in New Zealand is free, especially for emergency services. It is a fantastic system. It is welcoming to everyone. And I just do find that super refreshing compared to other parts of the world. Again, I lived and worked in Canada, Australia, USA, France, and New Zealand is on par with some of the most welcoming and open-minded healthcare system, which I find that really good. Moving on to education, this is a picture of a playground at a school in a very small town called Murupara, which is on North Island of New Zealand. Just for the tidbits right here to know what it is. So, school system in New Zealand is really good from primary to university, and universities in New Zealand are actually ranked like in the top, I think, 20 in the world. They're really good universities here. So there is no too much pressure of like, which university you're going to go to? Oh, I didn't get into this one. I didn't get into that one. It is fine. It's seriously fine. The universities are world recognized. They're really good. They're also quite relaxed. So and whatever university you are going in, if you are you will be respected in your field as long as you have the the correct diploma. So yes, there is not too much pressure on university right here. It's not a life-changing decision as soon as you make it. So that's a really good point for New Zealand right here. Moving on, New Zealand is a massive melting pot. New Zealand is a country of immigrants, and it feels like it is. Everybody is welcoming everyone of every color. There is so many different cultures mashing together. You can get some, Indian foods in almost every corners, but you get some Asian food, some Japanese food. Like it's kind of like it feels like a melting pot. You have people all every races and every colors everywhere, and it just feels good. It's a fun melting pot, and it's easy to meet people from all around the world right here in New Zealand. So that's a good pro in my book as well. Moving on to safety, that is a real pictures, guys. That is the town of Bulls in the North Island of New Zealand, where they do puns with the word bulls almost everywhere in the town. And in the police station, if you guys see under the sign of Bulls right here, it says constable. So that's just a constable, but a constable. It's funny, right? Anyway, we're talking about safety. New Zealand is super safe. There is very rarely like firearms incidents or anything like that. New Zealand is an extremely safe country to live in. A lot of our neighbors don't even close their doors, and sometimes we do forget about closing our doors. So yeah, don't panic about safety in New Zealand. Yes, New Zealand is super safe if that's one of your worries. Okay, next up, it is quite easy to start a business in New Zealand. That's a picture of me when I started one of my first business in New Zealand. It's actually ranked in some of the best country in the world to start a business. The paperwork is quite easy, the tax system is quite simple, and there are plenty of opportunities just because there is a lack of people in New Zealand. There is only about 5 million people living in New Zealand, and about a quarter or about a third of that is living in Auckland. So if you go anywhere out of Auckland, there are a ton of business opportunities here. I have taken advantage of that. I've started multiple businesses in New Zealand successfully, and I'm very happy with that. So if you are a bit of an entrepreneur spirit, well, New Zealand may be the right country for you. Moving on to the next pros is politics. So simply put, politics doesn't matter in New Zealand. There are many other countries in the world in which you are going to be labeled straight away. If you are, a supporter of one side or the other, straight away you are put into like a box. And politics is extremely divisive. It is not the case in New Zealand. Politics is just another small aspect of life, and if you don't agree with someone, it's just going to be brushed over quite quickly, and that'll be absolutely fine. It's up to you to move on as fast as other people will be moving on that, and you can have friends in every side of the aisles. Yes, there are different parties in New Zealand, the two main party being Labour and National, but that really doesn't mean that this defines who you are. This defines what are your friends and who you can hang out with, and I find that super refreshing in our current environment where politics is extremely divisive and runs on divisions. You will also find that the debate and anything to do with politics in New Zealand is very civil and orientated onto policies and their implementation, rather than just you are bad, no, you're worse, and that's it. So yeah, that's a pro for me. Alright, moving on to racism. So simply put, New Zealand doesn't really have too much racism. There are the odd bunch of people which are racist here and there, like in every country, but I find New Zealand extremely inclusive. The Maori culture are the Polynesian cultures that were living in New Zealand before the English colonists arrived, and that formed New Zealand, and literally New Zealand was born into the coming together of two cultures. So racism just really doesn't fit into the core of what New Zealand really is, and I find the lack of racism so amazing in New Zealand, and for me, major pro, sorry about that. Alright, moving on to the LGBTQ community. New Zealand is super friendly to any kind of orientation. You can be whoever you want to be in New Zealand. Same-sex marriage is legal in New Zealand. Simply put, nobody cares who you want to sleep next to. Just be yourself, and people are super welcoming of that. There are some parts of New Zealand, some areas of New Zealand and of cities which have thriving scenes for the LGBTQ community. Me talking fast and trying to do acronyms just doesn't work together. And on top of that, the Gay Pride in New Zealand is a fantastic party. It's phenomenal. So yeah, major pro for me again. Alright, moving on to the fact that everybody knows everybody. In New Zealand, everybody knows everybody for real. You literally only have to ask like about 4 people and you will be put in touch with the right person you want to meet in New Zealand. It's really awesome. This is a picture of me going on a tour, and some of the people right here were some members of some tourism boards, some other tourism operators that were joining other tourism operators to do the same tours. And you kind of just go sometimes just do one thing, and then you meet like 10 people that then are going to be really helpful to you, and that you're going to be able to help as well, and everything. It's just so awesome how you can connect with people super easily, and you don't have to just rely on like the Facebook thing. Again, it's easy to meet people in New Zealand, and you don't necessarily have to rely on social media, because social media end up always making you feel so alone. Or maybe it's just me. Alright, moving on to the last point for my pros, and that's a bit of a biased one because obviously this usually is a travel channel, but traveling in New Zealand is super easy. Traveling throughout the country is easy. Traveling around the country is easy. There, you hop on a train, you hop on a car, you hop on a plane, you hop on a bus, and you'll get wherever you want to go quite easily. The country is fantastic to explore. It is just so good, and being able to make your way around the country super easily is phenomenal. So there are so many different ways to travel New Zealand. We do have a video on that on the channel. We do have some article on nzpocketguide.com, which is the largest travel guide to New Zealand. It's free to use, obviously. It's the best travel guide ever written for New Zealand. I'm going to tell you that because I'm literally behind this travel guide, but check it out if you are ever planning to come to New Zealand to visit, or even to move to New Zealand. If you want to know a little bit more about the cities that you are comparing, there is a ton of information for you right there at nzpocketguide.com. Alright, so now we're going to be moving on to the pros, to the cons. I'm going to be taking a glass of water quickly. Alright, so all the cons that are right here, there is a few more. So there was 12 pros, there are going to be 14 cons. And I just want to point out, first up, I chose to live in New Zealand. So all those cons do not outweigh the pros. Second, you're going to find that a lot of them are a little bit more like nitpicking, but I just wanted to have kind of a thorough kind of list. And some of the cons right here are pros for me, and I explain that when we go through them. So all of that is to take with a grain of salt. I still love New Zealand. I chose to live here, so just putting that right here. But with that in mind, as a Frenchman that speaks with a strong French accent, or French-born man, I'm Kiwi since I'm resident in New Zealand, but yeah, the food is not that in New Zealand. I have to be honest, the food scene is not phenomenal here. Finding ingredients which are high quality is quite hard and often very expensive, and overall the food scene in New Zealand is just very average. You're gonna find sometimes Here is a picture of some food. You're gonna find sometimes that you know, you will find some odd, like fantastic places to eat, but usually it's just gonna be average, just because, well, it's just not that big part of the culture. You know, when they talk about like things which are like typically Kiwis and everything, they're usually not great food. There's some type of sausages or some, you know, putting a hot dog into a sliced bread rather than a hot dog bun and those kind of things. So the inherent part of the culture is not super foodie. So your, you know, buttery, flaky, crunchy croissant in the morning it's just not going to happen in New Zealand. So yeah, that's my first con. Moving on to the next con, look at me doing my grocery shopping. We have photos of everything. Is the fact that New Zealand is quite expensive. So, you know, everything in New Zealand is quite expensive just because first we have a very low population. Again, we only have about 5 million inhabitants in New Zealand, and about a third of that is in Auckland. So finding workforce is a bit harder, so therefore you may have to pay the workforce a little bit more. But also there is also a lot of things that we have to get from overseas. So from my personal experience, I've lived in Australia, Canada, USA and France, and I've also, you know, spent quite a decent amount of time in Hong Kong and other places like that. New Zealand is really expensive. If I were to compare to the US, for example, I will say that for most things, New Zealand is close to twice more expensive, 1.5 to twice more expensive for most things. In fact, quite often we do have to get stuff from the US and ship it to New Zealand, and that still gets here way cheaper than usually to get it here in New Zealand. So keeping that in mind, that New Zealand, both traveling, living, just every cost, like, you know, the cost of power in New Zealand is expensive, the cost of housing is expensive, the cost of gas is expensive, the cost of food is expensive, the cost of activities in New Zealand is expensive, the cost of transportation is expensive. Everything is going to be a little bit expensive. New Zealand is an experience, and so if money is a concern for you, New Zealand may not be the best place for you. And it's a well-known fact. I mean, you will find you know, information about how expensive in New Zealand pretty much everywhere. All right, moving on to our next con is the fact that New Zealand is quite far away from many places. So if you are really into international travel, then New Zealand may not be the best place for you. New Zealand is super isolated. We're basically at the bottom of the world. So, you know, you fly 3 hours, you get to Australia, and then you can get a connecting flight to go somewhere else. There are a lot of direct flights to kind of the US and Asian countries as well. But, you know, it will take you 7 hours to go to Asia. Will take you about 10 to 12 hours to go to the US, and it takes a while to get to New Zealand. It is, you know, physically draining. So overseas travel is not necessarily the best thing to do. So if you are really into that, you may want to move to LA, where you can fly everywhere you want very easily. You wouldn't have to do a million connecting flights to go to where, you know, to get to where you want to go. With that in mind, New Zealand is super fun to explore. I talked about it during my pros list, and there is a ton of South Pacific islands to explore which are quite nearby, and they're fantastic to visit. In fact, we do have travel guides. We have FijiPocketGuide.com, we have TongaPocketGuide.com, and much more. So you may want to check those one out to see what's going to be your new backyard to explore. But the South Pacific is awesome. Alright, the next con is the weather. Look, this is Laura, my partner right here, if you guys are not used to this channel. This is a channel about traveling in New Zealand, and usually I'm accompanied by a lady called Laura, which is not here with me today. So this is Laura flying above the clouds, because the weather in New Zealand is kind of a part of your New Zealand experience of its own. There is a local saying that New Zealand has 4 seasons in one day, and that is very true. It can be super windy in the morning, then around lunchtime it's going to be absolutely placid and beautiful sun, and then it's going to turn to rain by the end of the afternoon, and that is not uncommon in New Zealand at all. In fact, it pretty much happened today. So the pro of that is that if you start with a rainy day, you may get, you know, superb weather by the end of the day. The con is if you start with the superb weather, you still have to pack a rain jacket because it may start raining. But overall, it also creates the beauty of New Zealand. This is why New Zealand is so green and so beautiful, because there is enough water and sun to grow all those amazing plants. So I personally find it a pro, but a lot of people find it a cons because they like predictable weather. You're never going to have the same weather for an entire week, let alone for an entire day. Alright, moving on to the next con is that you will probably need a car to commute if you don't live in the CBD and work in the CBD of the city you're going to be settling in. And I'm mostly talking about the larger kind of towns. We're going to be talking about Christchurch, Wellington and Auckland, which has traffic issues right here. This photo right here is from Auckland. So if you do live in a city center, then the buses are going to be pretty good. Otherwise, if you live in the outer suburbs and work in a city center or work in a different suburbs, you will need your own car to commute around. It is kind of a fact in New Zealand. The public transport system seems to always be like 5 to 10 years behind what needs to be done. And so yeah, you will need a car, and that means that each of the family member will probably need a car. And this is why New Zealand has one of the highest ratio of cars per capita. So keep that in mind if you move to New Zealand. Moving on to the city life. So a lot of people are trying to talk to us about city life, i.e. nightlife in New Zealand. New Zealand is not going to be the nightlife that you're looking for. I simply put, if you are considering nightlife as one of the factors for moving to New Zealand, this is not going to be good for you. It's just as simple as that. This is the picture of the ice bar, by the way, in Queenstown. So there are some towns where there are going to be a bit more parties than other, i.e. Queenstown because it's a big tourist hub, and Dunedin because it's a big student hub. But even in Auckland, the nightlife is really not amazing. I mean, I've lived in LA, I've partied in Las Vegas, lived in Vancouver, and I partied there as well. This is nowhere near that. So if you are looking for clubbing scenes or anything like that, there is not going to be gigantic parties. There are a few festivals which draw really big crowds and which kind of emulate this kind of feeling that you can have, but that's it. So just know that. Moving on to shopping, availability. So everything you're going to want to get in New Zealand is going to be expensive, as we talked about, but you're also going to have quite limited choice. This comes with the fact that New Zealand is quite far from a lot of places, so we have to import a lot of things, but it also comes from the fact that there is not that many people. So it's easier to have a few standard stuff, and then if you need something really specific, you've got to get it from overseas. And this especially is true for like clothing. You have very limited. I mean, Laura is always struggling to find like decent yet affordable type of clothes. You usually have the affordable stuff that's going to break in 5 minutes, or the unbelievably expensive stuff that's going to last you for longer. So it's hard to find a middle ground in there. So finding choice when shopping around is kind of a challenge in New Zealand. But with that in mind, it forces you to look elsewhere. Shopping is not the only thing to do in life, and you may not need as many new stuff as you think you need. So for me, it's a pro. Moving on to me dressed up as a massive kiwi bird going in a shopping store to talk about consumer laws. So New Zealand does have some really good consumer laws. Yes, sadly there is very limited amount of bodies and government entities that can actually enforce those laws, and therefore as a consumer you have to be really shrewd and you have to know what are your rights in order not to be taken advantage of. It is very often the case that the company will try something unless you tell them that you can't do that, and then at that point they're going to say, oh yeah, you are right, we'll do it the right way. It is kind of an everyday occurrence when you are actually living in New Zealand. When you're a tourist traveling around New Zealand, that doesn't really happen that often, but when you are actually living in New Zealand, it is very often that companies try to take advantage of you. I helped a lot of my neighbors, my older neighbors, to deal with their power companies that were taking advantage of them, for example. So yeah, they do have some plans that they should give to seniors, but they don't if you don't ask for them and ask them in writing and all those kind of things. So just those kind of things. So anyway, know your right if you decide to move to New Zealand, and make sure that you're willing to assert those rights and say that you're right, because like that you won't be taken advantage of. All right, moving on to the fact that there is a lot of know who rather than know how. So that's mostly about the job market in New Zealand, and for most of my time in New Zealand I have been self-employed, so that hasn't really affected me too much, but it's things that I've heard from a lot of people. So this is more hearsay, but I've lived in New Zealand, I worked as an employee in New Zealand for a good year and a half to 2 years, so I've done that fair share. I haven't really experienced that too much, but Okay, so the story goes that a lot of the time, if you know someone that's looking for someone to work there, then you're probably going to get the job, rather than if you're a very well qualified person ready to do the job. Usually people are more going to go for their mates. That's kind of like a trend in New Zealand. It is in certain industries more pronounced than others, but yeah, it's just something to keep in mind on the job market. Alright, this is the picture of me trying to get on the internet, to tell you that getting on the internet in New Zealand can be sometimes a little bit slow. Alright, so well, we know that we work on the internet all the time. The coverage of internet in New Zealand is quite sporadic. You won't have fiber everywhere. They are trying to roll it out, but it's not there just yet, and it is rather expensive. Getting decent internet in New Zealand is not that easy, and you know, uploading videos for us, for example, uploading this video right here on YouTube is going to take us quite a while. You know, sometimes I just leave the computer running overnight and it uploads about like 2 videos, and that's pretty much it for an entire overnighter. Just to give you some context right here. Otherwise, when you want to just stream something or watch something, usually it works perfectly fine. Alright, moving on to housing. So a well-known fact about New Zealand is that there is a massive housing bubble. Housing is extremely expensive. It's never been that expensive. It's extremely unaffordable for young people to be able to get themselves a house, and you know, this is why New Zealanders tend to be renters rather than homeowners. So be aware of that. The housing market is incredibly expensive, and if you're planning an actual move to New Zealand, you need to be prepared for that, because yeah, you're going to be paying a lot for your homes. And the problem with New Zealand homes is that because the housing market is so expensive right now, even the older homes, which are vast majority of homes in New Zealand, are going at expensive, exorbitant rates right now. So be aware of that. Alright, this sad picture is Laura looking at the Cathedral of Christchurch, because we're going to be talking about earthquakes. There are thousands, in fact there are tens of thousands of earthquakes in New Zealand every single year. Most of them are incredibly mild and you can't feel them whatsoever, but once in a while there is a major earthquake. This does not mean that New Zealand is not safe. When there are earthquakes in New Zealand, the casualties rates are always very low. I mean, 1 is always too many, but they are always very low compared to other places in the world that will have similar strength earthquakes. Major earthquakes in New Zealand that hit major city only happen, I mean, the last one that happened was almost 10 years ago or something like that, so really a long time ago. So it really doesn't happen that often, but they are a part of everyday life in New Zealand. Sometimes you can feel a little jolt, but it's really... If earthquake is a worry for you moving to New Zealand, I think you can put that to rest, and that should not be a worry in New Zealand. But because that's something that some people are talking about, I felt like including into this list. For me, no bother whatsoever. Moving on to the slower pace of life. That's my second to last con. It's a pro and a con, right? The pace of life in New Zealand is slower. So that means that if you want to get things done, you want to get a plumber here, or you're going to need an electrician, you need this or you need that done, you need a business, you can have chop and get that done. That's probably not going to happen at the speed you want it to happen. But on the other hand, that also means that your work life is going to be a little bit more relaxed. The work and life balance in New Zealand is definitely super relaxed, and you know, that could be a pro, but it is in the category of cons, because sometimes you just want to get something done. So yeah, as I said, some pros are going to be half pro, half cons. Look at me relaxing on the tree. I mean, you know, I'm enjoying the pace of life right here. Alright, and moving on to the last cons of New Zealand, and that's definitely for people which are planning to move to New Zealand, you know, permanently, is that the immigration processes are long, tedious, and extremely expensive. So you want to make sure that you have done your research before moving to New Zealand. I cannot stress enough that the real advice is to come to travel to New Zealand and then to move here. I've done that. When I was in Australia, I took a 2-week trip to New Zealand. I really enjoyed it. Then I came back to New Zealand on something called a working holiday visa, which is kind of a gap year visa that allows you to work and travel in New Zealand for an entire year. And then only at that point I decided, you know what, I want to stay a little bit longer in New Zealand. Guess what? I only got myself a work visa at that point. And then after that, I decided to get myself residency, because after all that, I was like, I'm sure New Zealand is for me, because it cost thousands and thousands and sometimes tens of thousands of dollars to get that sorted. So you may want to make sure that New Zealand is the right thing for you. With that in mind, this concludes our pros and cons list of New Zealand. So I hope that you did find that super useful. If you did, it took us hours to get this video together for you, so you may want to hit the like button to say thank you for all our hard work. If you are planning to travel to New Zealand first, you may want to check out more videos on this channel. We have like over 1,000 videos on the channel right now about things to do in New Zealand and all our travel tips. If you want to check out nzpocketguide.com, there is a ton of information about the life in New Zealand as well as travel tips for New Zealand, because it is the largest travel guide to New Zealand. And if you want to hear more from us, see more videos about New Zealand, if you want to support the channel, you can also hit subscribe, because YouTube always send me emails saying you need to tell your subscriber to subscribe. So here you go, YouTube, I've just done it. In the meantime, keep traveling safe, have fun around the world, be kind to each other, and enjoy life. Bye bye.